It is a truth known to women of a certain age, child, that invisibility is a cloak one learns to wear. At first it chafes. This realization that the eyes of the world no longer linger, that one has become part of the room's furniture. But in time, the cloak becomes a comfort. It allows for observation, it grants a quiet, overlooked freedom. And for Susanna Millward, at 50 years of age, the cloak was as familiar as her own skin. She stood now in the shadow of a potted palm in her cousin Agatha's ballroom, the Franz, a convenient screen from the glittering crush of London society. Her dress was grey silk, respectable and forgettable, the very color of invisibility. From her vantage point, she could see everything. She saw her cousin, florid and anxious, her fan beating the air like a trapped bird's wing. She saw Agatha's daughters, Lavinia and Charlotte, shimmering in pastel silks, their eyes bright with the twin fires of hope and competition. And she saw the servants, their faces pale with exhaustion, moving like ghosts at the edges of the splendor, their work as essential and as unremarked upon as her own. For 2 weeks, Susanna had been the silent engine of this affair. It was her hand that had addressed the invitations in flawless copperplate, her mind that had negotiated with the caterers, her eye that had approved the floral arrangements. She was the family's poor relation, the spinster cousin taken in out of charity after her father's unfortunate investments had left her with nothing but a good name and a head for numbers. In return for her keep, she managed the Pemberton household with a quiet efficiency that they took entirely for granted. She was, in the words her cousin Alfred had once used with careless cruelty, as useful as a good ledger. The phrase had stuck, a small, sharp burr, in the fabric of her thoughts. As useful as a good ledger. It was true, she supposed. She contained facts. She balanced accounts. She was reliable, uncomplaining, and utterly devoid of romance. She was a column of figures in a world that only valued poetry. A minor crisis was unfolding near the champagne fountain. A young lieutenant, flushed with drink and ambition, had jostled the arm of the elderly Countess of Fenmore, sending a cascade of pale gold wine down the front of the Countess's lavender gown. The Countess gasped, a small, horrified sound. The lieutenant stammered apologies. Agatha, seeing it from across the room, looked as if she might faint. A scene was a disaster, and a scene involving a countess was a catastrophe. Before anyone else could react, before Agatha could rush over and make things 1,000 times worse with her flustered apologies, Susanna moved. She did not hurry. Cut. She simply emerged from the shadows of the palm, a linen napkin already in her hand. She was at the Countess's side in a moment, her voice low and calm. "A dreadful nuisance, my lady," she murmured, already dabbing gently at the spreading stain. "If you would permit me, there's a retiring room just through here. A little soda water and salt, and the silk will not remember a thing." She did not look at the lieutenant. She did not acknowledge the circle of curious eyes. Her focus was entirely on the Countess, a small, steady island of calm in a sea of rising panic. The old woman, flustered and embarrassed, looked at Susanna's plain, kind face and found herself nodding. Susanna offered a steadying arm, her touch firm and impersonal. "This way, my lady." She guided the Countess from the room, her movements economical and serene. No one remarked upon her intervention. No one thanked her. The crisis was simply handled. The social machinery whirred on, uninterrupted. Susanna Millward, the useful component, had done her job. She returned to her post behind the palm tree, the damp napkin tucked discreetly into her pocket, her cloak of invisibility settling once more around her shoulders. She had given up on being seen long ago. It was enough now to be of use. Across the ballroom, a man watched this small drama unfold. He noticed things. It was a habit born of a lifetime of command and a decade of profound, isolating grief. Henry, the Duke of Wycliffe, had a reputation for coldness that was as vast and as chilling as his northern estate. He stood alone, a pillar of black broadcloth in a churning sea of color, and the crowd gave him a wide berth, as if his sorrow were a communicable disease he had not wanted to come. He despised these London squeezes, the empty chatter, the grasping ambition in the eyes of the mothers, the brittle laughter of their daughters. But his solicitor had insisted, "Ah, you must be seen. Your Grace, you must appear normal. Especially now, especially now." The words were a constant low drumbeat beneath the surface of his thoughts. He noticed the sweat on his hostess' brow. He noticed the way Lavinia Pemberton's smile did not quite reach her eyes. He noticed the tremor in the hand of the servant pouring his wine. And he had noticed the woman in gray. He had seen her earlier, speaking quietly to the orchestra leader, a slight adjustment to the tempo, and the rhythm of the room had subtly improved. He had seen her intercept a footman and murmur a word, and a moment later, a draught from an open window that had been troubling the dowagers was gone. And he had just seen her manage the Countess of Fenmore with a quiet authority that was more commanding than any title. She moved through the mechanics of the evening like a master artisan, her touch invisible, but her effect profound. She was not furniture, she was the architect. Then he heard the voice, sharp and carrying, of Lady Beatrice Ashworth, his late wife's sister-in-law. Beatrice was speaking to Agatha Pemberton, her tone laced with that particular brand of sweet venom she favored. My dear Agatha, you are a marvel to host such a crush, but you must be exhausted. You should let your girls manage these things. You cannot rely on poor Susanna forever. A woman of her, a J. Well, it is a kindness to keep her, of course. But one must not overburden the charity." Agatha flushed, stammering something about Susanna being a great help, but the barb had landed sharp and public. Susanna, who had just returned to her post, heard it. The Duke saw her posture straighten, just for a second. He saw the smallest tightening of her hands, clasped before her. He saw her face remain a perfect, placid mask. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply stood, absorbing the casual cruelty, as if it were no more than a passing breeze. And in that moment, something in the Duke shifted. For 10 years he had been encased in the ice of his own grief, isolated by a rank that was a fortress and a prison. He was surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His title, his fortune, his name. They flattered him, feared him, schemed around him, but none of them saw him. They saw the Duke of Wycliffe, a prize, a problem, a monument. But this woman, this quiet woman in gray, whom the world treated as a fixture, possessed a stillness and a substance that felt more real than anyone else in the glittering hollow room. He had come here tonight on his solicitor's advice, to find a solution to a problem that threatened to destroy what was left of his world. He had been told he needed a duchess, a respectable front, a woman of impeccable breeding, to silence the whispers and secure his Suna's future. He had surveyed the room of shimmering debutantes and seen nothing but a collection of dolls, beautiful and empty. He looked at Susanna Millward. He saw the intelligence in her quiet eyes. He saw the strength in her stillness. He saw the dignity that had refused to crumble under a public slight. He did not see a solution. He saw a person, and the Duke of Wycliffe, who had not taken an impulsive step in a decade, began to cross the room. A path cleared before him as if by magic. Mothers pushed their daughters forward. Conversations faltered. The music seemed to dim. Every eye was on him, the cold, untouchable Duke, as he moved with purpose. He walked past Charlotte. He walked past the Countess of Fenmore, now restored and holding court. He walked directly toward the potted palm, toward the shadow where a woman in a gray dress stood, believing herself to be invisible. He stopped before her. Susanna looked up, her expression one of mild, impersonal inquiry, the same look she might give a footman asking for direction. She assumed he was lost, or perhaps in need of some service she could quietly provide. "Ah, Your Grace," she said, her voice even. May I be of assistance?" Lady Beatrice's mouth was a thin, hard line. Agatha Pemberton looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Henry, Duke of Wycliffe, looked down at the woman who had given up on being seen. He saw the fine lines around her eyes, the faint dusting of flower-shod mist on her sleeve from her afternoon check of the kitchens, the steadfast calm in her gaze. "A Mrs. Millward," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the sudden silence. They told me I would find no one of substance in London this season. They were wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the stunned air. "I am in need of someone who sees what is, not what is supposed to be. I am told you are such a person. I find I am in desperate need of your assistance." It was not a proposal. It was not a flirtation. It was something far stranger, far more shocking. It was a public declaration of need. And it was aimed not at a beauty or an heiress, but at the forgotten woman in the corner. For the first time that evening, Susanna Millward's composure faltered. A flicker of sheer, unadulterated shock crossed her face before she mastered it. She had been seen, and she had no idea what it meant. The next morning, the Duke's carriage arrived at the Pemberton townhouse. Not for Agatha, not for her daughters, but for Susanna. The summons had been delivered by a footman in the Wycliffe livery, a crisp note requesting her presence at the Duke's solicitor's office, in Lincane's Inn Fields at 10. Agatha had been beside herself, a whirlwind of questions and speculation that Susanna had calmly deflected. The air in the house was thick with a mixture of awe and resentment. Lavinia and Charlotte watched her with narrowed, envious eyes. She was no longer furniture. She was a mystery, and therefore a threat. Susanna dressed in the same gray silk. It was her best. She felt a strange sense of unreality as the Wycliffe footman handed her into the carriage. The seats were upholstered in dark blue leather, the air inside smelling of wax and old paper, and a faint, clean scent of the cold that seemed to cling to the Duke himself. The journey was silent, the seat's cacophony muted by the thick glass. She felt as though she were in a bell jar, moving through a world that could no longer touch her. Mr. Abernathy, the solicitor, was a small, dry man who looked as though he had been desiccated by years of proximity to dusty legal texts. He received her with a deference that was startling. The Duke was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the grey London sky. He turned as she entered, and the room seemed to shrink around his presence. "A Mrs. Millward, thank you for coming," he said. There was no preamble, no small talk. Men like the Duke did not waste time on such things. He gestured to a chair. "Tea, please." She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was a woman accustomed to waiting for instructions. Mr. Abernathy will apprise you of the particulars," the Duke said, his voice clipped. "But the heart of the matter is this. My Sona's future is at risk." Abernathy cleared his throat. "Your Grace, as you know, upon the death of the late Duchess, a significant portion of her personal fortune passed, not to you, but into a trust for your son and heir, Lord Arthur. The trustees are myself, the Duke, and the late Duchess's brother, Lord Ashworth." Susanna's mind, always quick with details, filed the name away. Ashworth. The same family as the sharp-tongued Lady Beatrice. A Lord Ashworth, the solicitor continued, has expressed concerns. He has suggested that the Duke's household is not a suitable environment for a young boy. He speaks of neglect, of disorder. He has even made insinuations regarding the financial stability of the Wycliffe estate itself. The Duke's jaw tightened. He is lying. He wants control of Arthur's inheritance. To get it, he must prove me an unfit father. The disorder in my house is not neglect, it is grief. But a court of law does not easily distinguish between the two. Here it was. The cold, hard truth behind the cryptic offer in the ballroom. It was not her shepherding of a countess he had admired. It was her reputation for order. He needed a housekeeper, a glorified high-stakes housekeeper. The sense of unreality curdled into a familiar, weary disappointment. Of course, she was useful. A Lord Ashworth has petitioned the trustees for a formal review. Abernathy said a preliminary hearing is scheduled in 1 month. He intends to present an image of Wycliffe Manor as a place of chaos and ruinous expense, and his grace as a father lost in his own world, neglecting both his son and his duties. If the trustees find in his favor, they could grant Lord Ashworth joint guardianship. It would be the first step to him taking my son. The last words were barely a whisper, a crack in the ducal ice. I need you to go to Wycliffe, the Duke said, turning from the window to face her directly. His eyes were the color of a winter sea. I need you to take my household and my estate accounts and put them in order, not just in order, in perfect, unassailable, irrefutable order. I need you to create a fortress of paper and ink that Ashworth cannot breach. I am told you have a genius. Forda Susanna was silent for a long moment. She looked from the anxious solicitor to the proud, desperate Duke. They did not want a duchess. They wanted an accountant, a weapon. The role was familiar, just on a grander scale, but something was different this time. She had been summoned, not tolerated, and for the first time in her life, she felt the solid ground of leverage beneath her feet. She met the Duca's gaze. Before I answer, Your Grace, you will tell me the truth. All of it. Abernathy sputtered. My dear Mrs. Milwarda. The Duke held up a hand, silencing him. He inclined his head, a flicker of surprise and respect in his eyes. Very well. What do you wish to know? Is your household in disorder? It is, he said without hesitation. Since my wife's death, it has been a house without a heart. The staff are demoralized. The routines have collapsed. It is cold. Are your finances unstable? No. The Wycliffe estate is sound, but the accounts are chaotic. My last steward was a man recommended by Ashworth. He was dismissed for incompetence 6 months ago. The ledgers are a disaster. And your son? As she asked, her voice softening slightly. A lord. Arthur. What is the truth of him? The Duke looked away, back to the window. The silence stretched. Men do not always care to be seen, and dukes, least of all. He is 10 years old. He said finally, his voice rough. He has not been the same. Since his mother passed, he is quiet. He lives in a world of his own making. One I cannot seem to enter. The admission cost him dearly. She could hear it. Susanna took a deep breath. She was 50 years old. She had nothing to lose but a position that was slowly eroding her soul with 1,000 daily humiliations. Here was a chance to do something that mattered. Not to arrange flowers or soothe entitled countesses, but to save a child. Will accept, she said. Abernathy breathed a sigh of relief. The Duke turned back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Your salary will be have conditions, she interrupted quietly. The solicitor's jaw dropped. The Duke simply raised an eyebrow. Waiting a first, Susanna said, her voice clear and steady. Is not about a salary. You will provide for my needs. Second, if I am to do this, my authority over the household and its accounts must be absolute. Second, only to your own. Every member of your staff, from the steward to the scullery maid, will answer to me. There can be no question of my position. Agreed, the Duke said instantly. Third, I require full and unrestricted access to all papers. Every ledger, every receipt, every letter. No sealed boxes, no locked drawers. Agreed. And finally, she said, her gaze unwavering, I will not be a spy in your home, and I will not be a ghost. I will speak the truth of what I find, whether it is pleasant or not. And I will expect the same from you, especially concerning your son. His welfare is the heart of this, is it not? We will not treat him as a pawn in a legal battle. We will treat him as a grieving boy who needs his father. A blank. For a long moment, the Duke of Wycliffe just looked at her. The last vestiges of disappointment in her fell away, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder. He had expected a hired servant, grateful for the work. He had found a commander, setting the terms of an alliance. He had thought he was hiring a bookkeeper. He was beginning to suspect he had found something else entirely. Your conditions are met, Mrs. Millward," he said, and this time, the smile that touched his lips was real. It transformed his cold, severe face, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the ducal armor. "A welcome to my employ," she inclined her head. "A will be ready to leave for Wycliffe in the morning." She did not smile back. This was a business arrangement, a contract, and Susanna Millward knew from bitter experience that it was wisest not to invest hope in contracts. They had a way of being broken. Wycliffe Manor rose from the stark northern landscape like a fortress built of gray stone and sorrow. It stood on a cliff overlooking a churning, slate-colored sea, its windows like vacant eyes staring into the perpetual mist. As the carriage rolled up the long, weed-choked drive, Susanna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was the cold house the Duke had spoken of, a house frozen in grief. Her arrival was met not with ceremony, but with a sullen, watchful silence. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Gable, was a thin, severe woman, whose face seemed permanently pinched with disapproval. The butler, Jennings, moved with a leaden slowness, his shoulders slumped under the weight of some invisible burden. They looked at Susanna's plain gray dress and her unadorned bonnet, and their expressions made it clear they saw not a solution, but another temporary problem, another governess or companion, who would last a month before fleeing the oppressive gloom. The Duke had preceded her by a day to inform the staff of her arrival and her authority. It was clear his words had not been enough. She was an outsider, a commoner, a woman of no discernible importance. His Grace has installed you in the West Wing, Mama, Mrs. Grays," Gable said, her tone implying this was a decision of profound foolishness. The rooms are aired." The rooms were vast, cold, and draped in dust sheets, as if the entire wing had been holding its breath for a decade. A single, meager fire had been lit in the grate, sputtering and smoking, as if in protest. It did little to dispel the tomb-like chill. This was her first test. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. She could demand better, assert the authority the Duke had granted her, but that was not her way. Force met with force only created fractures. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Susanna said calmly. This will do perfectly. Could you have my trunk brought up, and perhaps a pot of tea? The journey was long." She looked around the room, not at the dust and the cold, but at the elegant bones of the space. The late Duchess had exquisite taste. This must have been a beautiful room when it was full of light. The mention of the late Duchess, calm and appreciative, caught the housekeeper off guard. Mrs. Gable Law's rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly. It was Ma, she said, her voice a fraction warmer. Her Grace loved the sea view. Then we must open the curtains, Susanna said simply, moving to the heavy velvet drapes herself. She pulled them back, and a pale, watery sunlight spilled into the room, illuminating a billion dancing dust motes. There. A house needs to breathe. She did not win them over in a day, or even a week. She won them by staying. She won them with a quiet, undramatic consistency that was more powerful than any command. She rose early and went to bed late. She learned the servantsa names. She noticed the scullery maid's chapped hands and quietly procured a pot of soothing balm. She saw that the stable boy was trying to read a tattered copy of a novel and left a newer, better one for him on a hay bale. She never raised her voice. She never complained. She simply worked. Her real work began in the estate office, a small, cold room dominated by a massive oak desk, and on the desk, piled in chaotic stacks, were the Wycliffe ledgers. The Duke had not exaggerated. They were a disaster. Pages were missing, entries were scrawled and blotted. The columns of figures were a tangled forest of incompetence. For days she did nothing but sit in the silence of that room, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a single candle burning beside her. As the autumn light faded, she did not try to impose order at first. She simply read, absorbing the story the numbers told. It was a story of a household in decline, of wasteful spending followed by sudden, panicked austerity. And beneath it all, she began to sense another story, a faint, discordant melody of transactions that made no sense. Payments for services never rendered. Invoices from companies she could not find a record of. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, all signed off by the previous steward, the one Lord Ashworth had recommended. She began a new ledger, a clean one bound in fresh leather, her own. In it, she began to rebuild the financial life of the estate, one painstaking entry at a time. Her handwriting was small, neat and perfectly clear. The columns of figures were as straight and true as a line of soldiers. She was bringing order to chaos, one number at a time. Of the Duke, she saw little. He remained in his own wing of the house, a remote and solitary figure. But he was watching. She knew it. Sometimes, she would look up from her work and feel the weight of his gaze from the doorway, where he stood for a moment in the shadows before retreating. He never spoke, not then. He was an observer, just as she was. He was waiting to see if his gamble had been a wise one, and of the child, Lord Arthur, she saw almost nothing at all. He was a ghost in the house, a whisper of footsteps in a distant corridor. The staff spoke of him in hushed tones. He took his meals alone in the nursery. He refused all new clothes, all toys, all comforts. He had a tutor, a nervous young man named Mr. Finch, who confessed to Susanna that the boy was not difficult, but unnervingly still. He reads, Mrs. Millward, Finch explained, wringing his hands. On household management, he asks me questions about crop yields and the price of coal. It is not natural for a boy of 10. Susanna knew she could not force an introduction. A grieving child, like a wounded animal, must be approached with infinite patience. One afternoon she took a small, blank ledger, identical to her own, and a newly sharpened pencil, and walked up the grand cold staircase to the nursery wing. The door was ajar. She knocked softly, a Lord Arthur. There was no reply. She pushed the door open. The room was as sparse and cold as a monkhouse cell. The boy was seated at a small table, his back to her, bent over a book. He was small for his age, with a shock of dark hair that fell over his brow, the same dark hair as his father. He did not turn. I do not require anything, thank you. His voice was unnervingly formal, a child playing at being a man. I am not here to bring you anything, Susanna said, her voice gentle. She walked into the room and placed the blank ledger on the corner of his table. I am here to give you something. He looked at the book, his brow furrowed in suspicion. I do not accept gifts. It is not a gift, she said. A house must know itself, Lord Arthur. Your father's house has been unwell. It has forgotten its own story. I am helping it to remember. I thought you might wish to help too. She did not wait for an answer. She simply retreated, leaving the ledger on his table. She stayed. That was her secret. Where every other governess had tried to coax and cajole and charm, and had fled within a month from the wall of silent grief, Susanna simply stayed. She opened the curtains in the morning. She kept the fire lit in her room. She worked on her ledgers, and she waited. 2 days later, as she was working in the estate office, a small shadow fell across her desk. She looked up. It was Arthur. He was standing in the doorway, clutching the blank ledger to his chest. He did not speak. He just stood there, watching her, his dark, serious eyes taking in the neat columns of her work. Susanna did not greet him with false cheerfulness. She simply nodded, as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world. A good afternoon, Lord Arthur. He took a hesitant step into the room. You are Mrs. Millward. It was a statement, not a question. I am. He held up the ledger. What is its purpose? To tell the truth, she said simply. Numbers do not lie, my lord. They tell a story, of what a house needs, what it spends, what it has. It is a very important story. He considered this for a long moment. Mr. Finch says I am not to trouble you. Mr. Finch is mistaken, Susanna replied, dipping her pen in the inkwell. Knowledge is never a trouble. Would you care to learn how to begin? He gave a single jerky nod. She pulled up a second chair. And in the cold, quiet estate office, with the autumn sea sighing outside the window, the 50-year-old spinster and the 10-year-old boy bent their heads together over a blank book and began to teach a house to know itself again. The Duke, passing the doorway on one of his silent patrols, stopped in the shadows and watched. He saw his sena's tense shoulders begin to relax. He saw the woman's patient hand guiding the boy's. He saw a flicker of warmth in the cold heart of his home, and, for the first time, Henry, Duke of Wycliffe, allowed himself to feel a fragile sliver of hope. The days shortened, bleeding into weeks. An unspoken routine settled over Wycliffe Manor. Each afternoon, Arthur would appear at the estate office, his own small ledger in hand. Susanna taught him the principles of double-entry bookkeeping, the elegant, logical dance of debits and credits. For any other child, it would have been a penance. For Arthur, it was a balm. The world of numbers was rational and predictable. It had rules. It was a safe harbor from the chaotic, unpredictable world of emotion that had stolen his mother. Susanna never pushed him to speak of his grief. Instead, she gave him tasks. Lord Arthur, could you ascertain from Mrs. Gable the exact expenditure on beeswax candles for the month of October? We must compare it to the cost of Talawa. The boy would march off on his mission, his face set with a solemn importance. He was no longer a ghost in the house. He was an auditor. The staff, at first wary, began to respond to his earnest queries with a gentle affection. They saw the life returning to his eyes, the purpose in his step. And they knew who was responsible. The quiet woman in gray, who asked for nothing and fixed everything. The Duke, too, found his own orbit shifting. His silent observations from the doorway became longer. Soon, he began to enter the room, standing by the mantelpiece, watching the unlikely pair at the desk. Then, one evening, he spoke. The stewardess' accounts for the East Pastures seem inflated, he said, his voice startling in the quiet room. Susanna looked up. They are, Your Grace. The invoices for feed are 20% higher than the market rate, and they are all from a supplier, a Northern Agricultural Goods, for which I can find no legitimate registration. The Duke's eyes narrowed. The company recommended by Ashworth's man. Yes, she said. A fiction created to siphon funds from your estate. It is one of several HA. From that evening on their sessions became a trio. The Duke would bring her a ledger, pointing out an anomaly he had noticed. Susanna would show him the corresponding pattern of fraud she had already uncovered in her own meticulous accounts. Arthur would listen, his eyes wide, absorbing the slow, steady revelation of his uncle's betrayal. They were a council of war, united against a common enemy. A fragile, unspoken trust began to weave itself among them. One night, a great storm rolled in from the sea, battering the stone walls of the manor. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain lashed against the windows. Just after midnight, a bolt of lightning struck a transformer on the estate, and the entire house was plunged into an abrupt, profound darkness. Susanna was in her room, dozing by the fire. She was on her feet in an instant, her mind clear. Her first thought was of Arthur. She lit a single candle, her hand steady, and made her way through the darkened, groaning corridors toward the nursery wing. She found him not in his bed, but standing by the window, a small, rigid silhouette against the lightning-fractured sky. He was trembling, but not, she sensed, with fear of the storm. Lord Arthur, she said softly. He started, turning to face her. In the flickering candlelight, his face was pale and slick with tears. The candles, he whispered. His voice choked. Mrs. Gable will have to light every candle in the house. The expensa, it will be ruinous, and in that moment, Susanna understood. It was not just an obsession with numbers, it was a deep, pathological fear of cost. The wound that Mr. Finch had hinted at, the wound his uncle had so cruelly inflicted, was laid bare. She did not offer him empty reassurances. She sat down on the window seat, her candle making a small warm pool of light in the vast darkness. "When I was a little girl," she said, her voice quiet and conversational, "Ammi father lost all his money. We were very poor. For a whole winter, we could afford only one candle a night. My mother and I would sit beside it, and she would tell me stories to make it last longer. We made a game of it. Seeing how much life we could find in one small flame, she looked at the boy, whose trembling had subsided as he listened. A candle is an expense, it is true, but so is a story, so is a moment of warmth in a cold house. Some things are worth the cost, my lord. Your comfort is worth the cost." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the wavering light. "Ah, my pony," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Uncle Ashworth said my pony was a terrible expense. He said, Mama was always worrying over the cost of it, that the worry made her illness worse. He said if I did not cost so much, she might have a—" He couldn't finish, a sob tore from his small chest. The crime was that he believed it. The cruelty of it took her breath away. To place such a monstrous burden on the shoulders of a child, Susanna's heart ached with a fierce, protective anger. She set her candle down and simply opened her arms. After a moment's hesitation, Arthur collapsed into her embrace, his small body shaking with the grief he had held inside for so long. She held him, stroking his hair, murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort. She was no longer Mrs. Millward, the bookkeeper. She was warmth. She was safety. She was the one who did not count the cost. She did not know how long they sat there, but when she looked up, the Duke was standing in the doorway, a candelabra in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He had heard. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible blazing fury and a profound shattering grief. He looked at his son, held in the arms of this quiet, steadfast woman, and he understood the true depth of his own failure. He had left his son alone with his monsters. He did not enter the room. He did not speak. To do so would have broken the spell. He simply stood witness, a silent sentinel in the dark. He watched as Susanna, the woman he had hired to balance his books, held the broken pieces of his family together. He had brought her here to be useful. He was beginning to understand that she was essential. The storm outside raged on. But inside the cold, dark room, a small, defiant warmth had been kindled, and three lonely people, huddled together in the dark, began ever so slowly to thaw. The letter arrived the following week, a crisp, formal document delivered from London. It was the formal petition from Lord Ashworth to the trustees, a copy sent to the Duke as required. It laid out in cold, legalistic language the case for his joint guardianship of Arthur. It cited the Duca's profound and continued state of mourning, his withdrawal from society and paternal duties, and most damningly, a schedule of a significant and worrying debts that threatened the stability of the Wycliffe estate. Attached were copies of promissory notes, apparently signed by the Duke, amounting to a small fortune. They were forgeries. Susanna knew it the moment she saw them. The signature was a near-perfect imitation of the Duca's hand, but it was too perfect. The Duca's real signature had a barely perceptible hesitation on the upstroke of the W, a flaw she had come to know intimately from studying hundreds of documents. These notes did not have it. They were the work of a skilled but unobservant forger. He has overplayed his hand, she said, laying the documents on the desk in the estate office. The Duke stood beside her, his face grim. Will a judge see it? I will make him see it," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet confidence. These forgeries are the final piece. They connect him not just to the mismanagement of the estate funds, but to a deliberate, fraudulent attempt to ruin you. This is no longer about competence. This is about crime. The hearing was set for 2 weeks' time. A new urgency settled over the house, but it was not the panicked urgency of before. It was the focused energy of a garrison preparing for a siege. Susanna worked tirelessly, her new ledger becoming a tome, a weapon forged of ink and paper. Every one of Ashworth's lies was dismantled, every forged invoice traced, every stolen shilling accounted for. Just as they were beginning to feel a sense of control, a second carriage arrived, this one unannounced. It was Lady Beatrice Ashworth, Lord Ashworth's sister. She swept into the house like a cold draught, her face a mask of false sympathy. Henry, my dear," she purred, taking the Duca's hands. "I came as soon as I heard this dreadful business with my brother. Of course he is only concerned for dear Arthura's welfare. We all are. I thought I would come and stay until the hearing to lend my support, and to see that the dear boy is being properly cared for." Our eyes, small and sharp, swept the room and landed on Susanna, who stood quietly by the fireplace. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened. "And you have hired a new housekeeper, I see. Ah, practical?" The battle had shifted. Ashworth was attacking on the legal front. His sister was here to open a second front, one of social cruelty and domestic sabotage. She moved through the house with an air of ownership, undermining Susanna's authority at every turn, her voice carrying as she issued countermanding orders to the servants. No, the late Duchess always preferred the roses in this vase. The new persona would not know that, of course. Is that what Lord Arthur is eating so plain? The poor dear looks half-starved. The staff who had come to respect and trust Susanna were thrown into confusion. Lady Beatrice was a titled lady, the late Duchess's own blood. Susanna was who was she? The worst of it was directed at Susanna herself, a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. Lady Beatrice would address her as a bookkeeper in front of guests, or compliment her on her sourced in plain dress. She treated her with the condescending kindness one might show to a clever dog. A hired bookkeeper, playing at lady of the manor. The phrase, her own fear given voice by another, echoed in Susanna's mind. Doubt, a cold and creeping thing, began to seep into the cracks of her composure. Was that what she was doing? Was this quiet sense of belonging she had begun to feel just a delusion? She was a paid employee, a temporary fix. When the hearing was over, she would be sent away, her usefulness at an end. The final blow came at dinner one evening. A few local dignitaries had been invited, part of the Duca's strategy, to appear engaged and normal. Lady Beatrice, holding court at the table, turned the conversation to Arthur. He seems a little better, I must admit," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation, "although he has the most peculiar attachment to the new housekeeper. It is a little worrying. A boy of his station needs a mother figure, of course, but one must be so careful about the influence of a hired help. They can develop such inappropriate ambitions." The table fell silent. The implication was ugly and clear. Susanna felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at her plate, her hands clenched in her lap, the cloak of invisibility she had worn for so long, suddenly feeling thin and useless. She was seen now, but only as a target. She waited for the Duke to say something to defend her, but he was silent, his face a thunderous mask of rage, his knuckles white where he gripped his wine-glass. He was a man unused to this kind of warfare, a battle fought with whispers and poisoned smiles. His silence felt like a confirmation of her status. She was his employee, and defending her too loudly would only give credence to the insinuation. She was on her own. Susanna lifted her head. She looked not at the Duke, but directly at Lady Beatrice. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry or defensive. It was calm and measured, the voice of a woman stating a simple fact. Guilty of what, my lady? She asked quietly. Of what ambition am I to be suspected? That your nephew might learn that kindness does not have a title, or that the truth can be found in a column of figures? I assure you, my only ambition at Wycliffe is to see the truth told and a child protected. I should have thought that was an ambition we all shared. The directness of the question, its simple, unadorned honesty, disarmed the entire table. It gave Lady Beatrice malice, nothing to cling to. The older woman flushed, sputtering. Oh well, I only meant a, but the moment was lost. Susanna had not fought back. She had simply held up a mirror to the other woman's ugliness, and the reflection had shamed her into silence. Later that night, the Duke found her in the estate office. The fire had burned down to embers. Ah, she will be leaving in the morning, he said abruptly. Susanna did not look up from her ledger. That is not necessary, Your Grace. It is he said, his voice raw. What she did, what she said, was unforgivable. I am sorry I did not speak. To have done so would have been a mistake, Susanna said, finally looking at him. It would have given her attack credibility. You lost that authority the moment you introduced me as hired help. Ho. He flinched as if she had struck him. That is what you are. The words were cold. A desperate retreat to the safety of their original contract. A chasm of silence opened between them. The fragile trust, the warmth kindled in the dark of the storm, seemed to vanish, consumed by the cold realities of rank and employment. Yes, Susanna said, her voice devoid of all emotion. I will have the final accounts ready for Mr. Abernathy by the end of the week. The hearing is on Tuesday. She turned back to her ledger, her pen scratching in the quiet room. The sound was the only barrier against the vast, echoing silence of the house. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the unspoken words a weight in his throat. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He turned and walked away, and the distance between them had never felt greater. The day of the hearing was gray and cold. The trustees were to meet in the library of Wycliffe Manor itself, a concession to the Duke's rank. The room had been prepared, the long mahogany table polished to a mere sheen, chairs set on either side like opposing armies. Lord Ashworth arrived with his solicitor, his face a mask of solemn concern that did not quite hide the avarice in his eyes. The trustees, two stern-faced old men, and Mr. Abernathy, took their seats at the head of the table. The Duke sat alone on his side, a formidable, unreadable presence in black. Susanna sat a few feet behind him as a clerk or a secretary might. She was in her familiar gray dress, a stack of her ledgers on a small table beside her. She felt a strange, hollow calm. Her work was done. What happened now was out of her hands. Ashworth's solicitor began, his voice smooth and practiced. He painted a masterful picture of a noble house in decline, ruled by a grief-stricken recluse. He spoke of the cancelled social engagements, the dismissed staff, the shuttered rooms. He presented evidence of the estate's supposed disarray, the very chaos Ashworth's dismissed steward had created. Then he produced the forged promissory notes. These documents, gentlemen, he said gravely, show a pattern of desperate borrowing. His Grace, in his distraction, has incurred debts that threaten the very foundation of his Sona's inheritance, the trustees murmured, their faces grim. The Duke remained impassive, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the rain-streaked windows. When it was his turn, Mr. Abernathy stood. His Grace does not intend to speak in his own defense, he announced, causing a stir. He believes the facts should speak for themselves. To that end, he has engaged an expert to conduct a full audit of the Wycliffe estate accounts. He calls Mrs. Susanna Millward. All eyes turned to her as she stood and walked to the table. Ashworth smirked, a look of contemptuous pity on his face. A spinster bookkeeper. What threat could she possibly be? Susanna did not look at him. She looked at the trustees. Gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and steady. For the past month, I have examined every financial record of this estate dating back 5 years. Lord Ashworth's solicitor is correct. There has been a systematic attempt to defraud the Duke of Wycliffe. However, he has mistaken the perpetrator. For the next hour, she spoke. She did not use rhetoric or emotion. She used numbers. With calm, irrefutable precision, she laid her ledgers open on the table. She walked them through the accounts, her finger tracing the lines of ink. She showed them the inflated invoices, the payments to shell companies, the subtle alterations in the old stewardess books. She explained the pattern, the slow siphoning of funds, and how every fictional company, every fraudulent transaction, traced back to a bank account opened in London by a man in the employ of Lord Ashworth. Then she picked up the forged promissory notes. These are clever forgeries," she said. But they are forgeries nonetheless." She placed one of the notes next to a legitimate document signed by the Duke. "If you look closely at His Grace's authentic signature, you will notice a small T at His Grace's authentic signature. Almost imperceptible hesitation on the upstroke of the AW. It is a habit of the pen. It is present on every document he has ever signed. It is, you might say, the signature within the signature. She paused. It is absent on these notes." A dead silence fell over the room. Lord Ashworth had gone pale. His solicitor was shuffling his papers, his composure shattered. The debts are phantoms," Susanna concluded, her voice ringing with the quiet power of truth. The chaos was manufactured. This was not a case of neglect. It was a calculated plot to seize control of a childless fortune. She returned to her seat, her part played. The trustees were whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Lord Ashworth began to bluster, to deny, but his words were hollow, the lies stripped bare. His carefully constructed reality had been dismantled by a quiet woman with a head for numbers. But the final decisive blow came from an unexpected quarter. The head trustee, a stern old baron, cleared his throat. This is all very compelling, but the core of the petition remains, the welfare of the child. We must speak to Lord Arthur." A footman was sent. A few minutes later, Arthur appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, his face pale but composed. He looked at the assembly of stern men, his eyes lingering on his uncle's furious face, then on his father's impassive one. Lord Arthur," the baron said, his voice gentle. We are here to decide what is best for you. I must ask you, do you feel happy here? Do you feel cared for by your father?" Arthur was silent for a long time, his small hands clasped behind his back. The fate of his world hung on his answer. He looked at his uncle. You told me I cost too much," he said, his childish voice preternaturally clear in the silent room. You told me my mother," he faltered, the memory of that cruel poison choking him. He took a breath, and his gaze shifted, finding Susanna where she sat behind his father. Their eyes met. He saw her small, encouraging nod. He straightened his shoulders. Mrs. Millward taught me that a house must know itself," he declared. My father's house is not in debt. It is in grief. There is a difference." Then he did something no one expected. He walked past his uncle, past the trustees, past his own father. He walked directly to Susanna's side, and his small hand reached out and took hers. He stood beside her, a small, defiant soldier, claiming his ally. She stayed, he said simply, looking at the stunned trustees. Everyone else left. She stayed. It was over. The declaration of belonging, spoken in a childish, clear voice, was more powerful than any legal argument. Lord Ashworth was ruined, not by a court of law, but by the truth spoken in a library. He sat, exposed and defeated, in a room that no longer believed him. The trustees found unanimously in the Duke's favor. The hearing was adjourned. In the aftermath, the library slowly emptied, leaving only the three of them, the Duke, the boy still clutching Susanna's hand, and the woman who had brought them through the fire. The fortress of paper and ink had held. That evening, a profound quiet settled over Wycliffe Manor. It was not the oppressive silence of grief, but the peaceful quiet of a storm that has passed. The fires in the hearths burned brightly, pushing back the shadows. The house felt as if it had taken its first deep breath in a decade. After Arthur was in bed, his sleep untroubled for the first time in memory, Susanna went to the estate office to put her ledgers away. Her work was finished. The contract was fulfilled. There was no reason for her to stay. She expected to be leaving in the morning, her usefulness expended. A familiar ache settled in her chest, the old, weary resignation of a life spent in other people's houses. She was carefully tying the ribbons on the last ledger when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He was not wearing his formal coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, the rigid armor of his rank set aside. He looked younger and tired and terribly human. "A Susanna," he said. Her name on his lips sounded strange and new. She did not turn. "A your grace. I trust everything is now to your satisfaction." "Ada, do not call me that," he said, his voice quiet. My name is Henry." He walked into the room and came to stand beside her, at the desk. For a long moment, he simply looked down at the stacks of ledgers, the testament to her quiet, relentless work. "I have been a fool," he said, the words raw and costing him. "Ah, and a coward. Grief was my excuse, but it became a habit. I sealed myself away. In this house, in my title, I let my son believe he was a burden. I let my brother-in-law's poison seep into the foundations of my home, because on some level, I believed I deserved it." He turned to look at her, and his eyes, the color of a winter sea, were no longer cold. They were filled with a deep, unguarded vulnerability. I was isolated by a reputation I thought protected me. It was a fortress, with no one inside. You walked into a house of ghosts, and reminded it how to breathe. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently touch the cover of the ledger she had just tied. "I hired you to save my estate, but it was my son you saved. It was me you saved." Susanna's heart was beating a painful, unfamiliar rhythm. "I only did the job I was hired for. No," he said softly. You did more. You stayed, you listened, you taught my son his own worth. You taught me, mind ye." He took a breath. "I need you to stay, Susanna. Not as my bookkeeper. Not as my employee." He paused, and the air in the room grew thick with the weight of unspoken things. "A stay as my wife." The words hung between them, as shocking and as world-altering as his first words to her in the ballroom. Susanna felt a dizzying surge of hope, followed immediately by the cold, sharp sting of caution. She had spent a lifetime learning not to hope. "I do not say that out of gratitude, Your Grace," she whispered. The title a shield she instinctively raised. "Our gratitude is a debt. It can be repaid. Do not offer me a title as payment for services rendered." Henry," he corrected her gently. He took a step closer, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Is it gratitude to feel that this room is cold when you are not in it? Is it gratitude to find that my Sona's laughter has become the most important sound in my world, a sound I had not heard in years until you came? Is it gratitude to admit that for the first time in a decade, I do not wish to be alone?" He reached out then and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm. At the Pemberton's ball, they were playing the part of a lady, a debutante, a duchess. "Then I saw you. You were not performing. You were simply a present and true. You were the only real person in the room. I think I have been searching for someone real for a very long time." He lifted her hand and looking into her eyes, he brushed his lips against her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent tenderness. "I am not offering you payment, Susanna. I am asking you to share a life, my life, Arthura's, to make this house a home together." to let me see you, every day, for the rest of my days. Tears she had not shed in 30 years pricked at the back of her eyes. She looked at this powerful, lonely man who had seen past her age, past her plain dress, past her lowly status, and had recognized the substance of her soul. He was not offering her a rescue. He was offering her a partnership. He was offering her a place to belong. She thought of the years of being overlooked, of the quiet humiliations, of the cloak of invisibility she had worn for so long, and she realized it was no longer a comfort, it was a cage. And he was offering her the key. A Henry, she said. And her own name, spoken aloud, was a promise. 6 months later, Susanna, Duchess of Wycliffe, stood in the morning room arranging a vase of late-blooming roses. Sunlight, rich and golden, streamed through the tall, clean windows, falling on the polished wood floors and the warm jewel tones of the rugs. The sound of laughter echoed from the gardens, outside Arthur's laughter, clear and unburdened, as he played with a new puppy his father had given him. The house was alive. The portraits of the Wycliffe ancestors, including the beautiful, sad-eyed late Duchess, seemed to look down with a gentle approval. Susanna often brought fresh flowers to place beneath her predecessor's portrait. The dead were not erased here. They were honored. Grief had been given its place, and in doing so, had allowed room for life to grow alongside it. Henry came into the room, and the sight of him still made her heart give a small happy lurch. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their son chase the puppy across the lawn. "A Mr. Abernathy sent the quarterly accounts," he murmured into her hair. "He says he has never seen the estate in better health." Susanna smiled. "A house must know itself." She turned in his arms to face him. Puh, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. At 51, she was no longer the woman who had given up on being seen. She was seen, every day, in the warm, steady gaze of her husband, in the trusting eyes of her son. Later in the study, she sat at the great oak desk, a new household ledger open before her. It was bound in dark blue leather to match the Wycliffe colors. Her colors now. The first pages were filled with her neat, clear script detailing the running of their home. It was a story of warmth and plenty, of a house healed and whole. Henry entered and came to stand behind her chair, his hand resting on her shoulder. He looked down at the open page. The final accounting," he said softly. Does everything balance, Your Grace?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of a quiet, unshakable love. Everything balances, my dear Duke," she replied. He had crossed a crowded room and seen only her. He had looked at a woman the world had deemed invisible, and seen the one person who could make his world whole. She had not been a replacement. She had not been a bargain discharged. She was the one who saw the truth in the numbers, and he was the one who saw the truth in her. She was the one who stayed.